Why is there so much confusion on the topic of creativity?
I think creativity speaks to something very deep about how we are as human beings in the world.
One of the biggest myths I feel is that are only artists creative.
There are many more diverse ways to this very romantic myth of who the creator is, usually the poet or the artist.
Can creativity be taught?
But for me, I've been educated and I'm a firm believer in the power of situations and cultures and context.
I think that one of the confusion also as to why creativity got reduced.
But they have meaning for personal development. So I think meaningfulness is probably for me the widest categories. Creativity as high art, creativity as revolutionary things, and so on.
It really takes courage. I feel most people aren't able to let go of their comfort zone.
I mean, it's a story of diversity. It's a story of meeting things that are different than you. A huge engine of creativity, even for people who never move. We are reducing a lot to the conscious mind, exactly as you said, to cognition, which is the way we think, to neuroscience, which is the brain and how it works. First thing that comes to mind when it's creativity is the light bulb, it's the idea. And ideas are great, and I love studying ideas. You cannot think anymore of creativity in purely individual terms. That is impossible. Creativity has always been shaped by the tools we use.
Something has to be useful in order for it to be called creative.
To see imagination in action, as it were. Wonder is about not knowing, that is generative things. It's about multiple potentialities, which I would call possibilities. Humans are very diverse. Who are we really, right? We are a species and individuals as well who kind of craft many, many stories about ourselves.
Welcome to the Creativity Dialogues. Today's episode is particularly special and meaningful to me because so far our interviews have been with practitioners or creatives, people who create. But something that's very close to my heart and my work are creativity studies. And today we get to speak a person who's from the world of academia, someone who studies creativity. So I think you're going to enjoy this episode and the different perspective that you would find in it. What does it mean to ask not just who creates, but where creativity lives? In the person, in the world between people, or in the space that opens up when both meet? My guest today has spent his career building a rigorous answer to that question. Born in Romania, he trained in psychology at the University of Bucharest before moving to the London School of Economics, where he completed his PhD in social psychology. That journey from Eastern Europe to one of the world's greatest institutions of social thought seems fitting for a scholar whose entire project is about creativity as something that crosses boundaries, cultures, and contexts. He is today a full professor of psychology at Dublin City University and director of the DCU Center for Possibility Studies. He's the founder of the transdisciplinary field of possibility studies and the author of Creativity, a very short introduction, and The Possible, a social cultural theory with Oxford University Press, and Wonder, the extraordinary power of an ordinary experience with Bloomsbury Press. He has proposed one of the most cited frameworks in contemporary creativity research, the 5 E's, which asks us to look beyond the individual creator and attend to the whole field in which creativity unfolds. The actor, the action, the artifact, the audience, and the affordances of the surrounding world. So far, as I just mentioned, on this podcast, I've spoken with practitioners across domains, but not the academic voices in the field of creativity. This is the first voice on the Creativity Dialogues, and I could not have chosen a better one. Welcome, Professor Vlad Glăveanu. So, welcome to the Creativity Dialogues, Vlad. It's such a pleasure to have you today because so far all our interviews have been with practitioners, with the creators, and today I am very, very honored and privileged that for the first time we have the academic perspective on creativity. Thank you so much for being here and for enlightening us with really the theoretical side of creativity.
Thank you so much for the invite. I'm really excited.
Likewise. So I think that perhaps the best place to begin would be that why is there so much confusion on the topic of creativity? We don't have this kind of confusion in other domains, be it psychology, philosophy, sociology, anthropology. These are well defined domains. Why is it that when it comes to creativity, there is so much of confusion, conflicting ideas? Like anthropology would say something different, sociology, the education field would say something different about creativity. Why do you think that this is the case?
It's a great question. A lot of people we start thinking, okay, what is creativity, which is part of the source of the confusion, to be honest. But it is, I think, because of both the complexity and the importance of creativity for us. I mean, to me, and I'm a little bit biased because I've been studying creativity for a long time, but I think creativity speaks to something very deep about how we are as human beings in the world. And humans are very diverse. And who are we really, right? We are a species and individuals as well who kind of craft many, many stories about ourselves. And creativity is so central to those stories. So I think, on the one hand, it is extremely unique and diverse. And then it's also kind of regulated by some type of patterns and principles in some ways. And I think it fascinates us and it causes so much discussion and debate because, especially in the day and age of today, but throughout time, definitely, I don't want to sound too, kind of glorifying the present, but we are faced with challenges that really call creativity and the help it can give us. Then the big question becomes, can we really harness it? And I think this is where we move into those confusions you mentioned. What kind of myths and preconceptions and false beliefs sometimes we have about creativity, because although I can't claim I'm the holder of the absolute truth about creativity, I definitely, and I think we can agree on that, there are ideas that hold us back, when it comes to what it means to create.
You know, one of the biggest myths I feel is that are only artists creative.
Right.
Where do you think this assumption came from? Could it be because that is an area where a practitioner works solo? Like, if, for example, a singer, a painter, an actor, that these people just work by themselves. It's their work is completely solo. Could this assumption have perhaps come because of that?
It's a very, very interesting as well. I mean, I like to look at creativity historically, and I will be honest. I mean, I'm kind of based in Europe. I'm Romanian originally. I live now in Ireland and work in Ireland, but it's a very Western space in many ways. So I'm much more familiar with Western history and culture, and I think it did contribute a lot to how we think of creativity today. But having said that, so I'm kind of putting a little disclaimer there. There are many more diverse ways, Eastern, Southern, Global South, of looking at this. So I think it's sometimes hard to even generalize. But to me, a lot of these ideas go back to romanticism, to this very romantic myth of who the creator is, which is usually the poet or the artist. And I think it's a good observation that oftentimes it is the individual. But even beyond that, I think there is something about self expression. There is something about this idea connected to the unconscious, connected to even madness. Dark romanticism was fascinated by these mavericks who were kind of the ones out, and also kind of, the dangers behind creativity. I mean, Frankenstein is a novel of dark romanticism. We might come back to this theme, the
Completely.
dark creativity theme. But I think, yeah, it goes back to art connects us to something so deep and inner and personal. But just to remind, ourselves and anyone listening, I'm also inspired by like American pragmatism authors like Dewey and all, who remind us that art has a very social life as well. So it is interesting also why we sometimes think of art as high art and just individual based, when there's so many dimensions to art that are public and shared. My doctoral work, for example, was on folk art, which is a very specific type of art. I mean, some people will not look at it, craft and arts. There's a whole debate there. But it's a very much a community type of artistic expression. So there are even different ways to think about art. But yeah, we usually take the most reified, individualistic, and kind of special ways, and then put creativity into that. Yeah.
I know. Uh, there's also this other idea
Mm.
that, people keep talking about creativity studies or can creativity be taught? What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, here I have good news for you and the listeners. I firmly believe that creativity can be developed, educated, taught, self-taught because, I'm a social psychologist by training. So psychology comes in many different shapes and forms. And some people look at more personality things like, personal traits, things people might be born with, predispositions, or clinical aspects. We was talking about the unconscious or this kind of, deep mental structures. But for me, I've been educated and I'm a firm believer in the power of situations and cultures and contexts. So I think for creativity, and this is again going against one of these deep assumptions that it's within you, you're born with it or you're not. It's something that, it's completely isolated from the outside. This is you at your most authentic. Absolutely, it can be that, but it is also very much shaped by context. And we don't even need to
Yes.
go further than thinking about why young children tend to take such joy and delight out of drawing. And then there is an age at which they stop drawing. I mean, some people might say, oh, it's the development of, no, it's the feedback they get. Most kids would get either negative feedback or less encouragement and then stop engaging in creativity. So the way that it's a negative example, then we have, and that's what we should pursue, is ideas of how can we foster, how can we encourage people to discover their own creative potential. And there are many, many useful ways to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that one of the confusion also as to why creativity got reduced, in at least in the average man's understanding, um, there's a tendency to just call creativity something new. I think that the average person got only the first part of the standard definition, which is novelty, but they completely missed the second part, which is
Yeah.
usefulness. So what do you think that this lack of this understanding, how has that confusion actually, aided in reducing creativity to just a buzzword that anybody feels they can use the word, although they don't really understand it, but they can use it. They wouldn't do this with psychology, with philosophy.
Yeah.
They wouldn't
Yeah.
dare to. How did this unfortunate thing
How did
happen
it
with
happen?
creativity?
Well, are we responsible, the researchers, maybe at some extent, to some extent? I think it's again a cultural tendency. These things correlate or kind of, connect with each other. This individualism, this focus on the person, on what's most intrinsic to you and novelty. In the scientific literature, we call it novelty bias and art bias. It's a tendency, it's a biased tendency to think every artist is creative, new means creative, but absolutely, there is so much more to creativity. And I'm going to challenge us and think there is even more than just novelty and usefulness. But just on the point of that, absolutely, when you work on craft like I did, and then I'm still very, very passionate about this idea of making with your own hands. And, it doesn't have to be handiwork, but it's this idea, it's a very kind of developmental process where you engage with materials, and it's not this revolutionary creativity, it's not radical novelty. It is something constructive, adaptive, transformative. So I think absolutely we need to let go of just this very kind of I'm going to say it, neoliberal economic view of disruptive innovation slash creativity. We often think of disruption today, and disruption is here, and it is a shape of creativity, but the creativity that often carries us, including in dealing with the negative consequences of a world in disruption, is the creativity that continues, that adapts, that is useful and meaningful. I would even say meaningful before useful, because utility is, what is practical value. For
Mhm.
example, children's
Mm.
drawings, they don't have economic value in that category of usefulness, but they have meaning for personal development. So I think meaningfulness is probably for me the widest category. So indeed, absolutely, I would catalog like creative things, ideas, or whatever practices as meaningful novelties, to absolutely kind of bring the two together and put meaningfulness almost before novelty, really.
No, that's perfect. When you spoke of this idea now, um, do you really believe in the five C's of
Mm,
creativity? Which is, the mini C,
yeah.
the small C, the pro C, and the big C. Do you agree with that, or do you sort of veer towards one
You're
side?
right.
I mean, I was just
Well,
curious. I was
funny you should ask.
curious.
So I know very well both the creators, James and Ron, of the framework, and I'm very good friends with both. So I will say that I agree that it's a very useful typology in the sense that it broke a binary that was very, very strong. It goes back to all this. A lot of these false ideas are because we set up oppositions. It's either individual or social. It's both. It's either disruptive or adaptive. It can be both. And the same thing is with kind of little and big or historical. It's either something you do every day, you cook a meal differently, or Picasso, or Marie Curie or whatever. Frida
Mm-hmm.
Kahlo. So it's a range. So I think what that model does very nicely is the continuum idea. I think mini C, which is like the pole where it's really recognizing the creativity embedded in the smallest acts of meaning making, of learning. I mean, that's a beautiful concept. I think it really challenges exactly what we said about creativity as high art, creativity as revolutionary things, and so on. But Pro C actually is probably one of the most interesting categories because it's the professional level. I mean, when I worked on craft, going back to that, a lot of this is hobbies for people, but some get you almost professionalized in the how do we recognize the kind of creativity that we do at work and beyond work that is not like genius level, but it's certainly more advanced than people who try it out, or do a little hobby. So I think it just shed light on kind of aspects of the continuum where it can go further. And I'm actually even now at this point in time involved with James, Ron, and others on kind of rethinking and advancing even this model, and looking beyond and so on.
Mm.
Of course, they're not only for categories, or these are not big buckets you can put stuff in, so I think there is room for more, and there is room for understanding the development of one category into another. And I think that was the original intention also of this theory, is to kind of see how things can progress. It's almost like this. Vygotsky would call it a zone of proximal development. What is the next in the way you express yourself creatively? So for all of this, I find it useful. But yeah, as always, every theory can be improved.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Vlad, how did you actually come to creativity? Can you share a little bit of your background, perhaps from childhood? I'm very curious that from psychology, even how did psychology really come on the
Oh,
radar for
we're
you
gonna
even
talk
before
about me for a
creativity?
long time. Yes, absolutely. Happy to share. So it's an interesting story. I'll try to summarize because otherwise it's too long. Um, uh, it's the creativity of one's identity and life course. Everybody has this, so we can even frame it like that. But I think psychology was interesting to me because I am interested in meaning making and symbols and everything, cultural and everything. And, we're going to make a bridge eventually in our chat about possibility. For me, psychology is about how we look at this human potential and potentiality. I'm really interested in how people develop and grow. And creativity is such a big part of that equation. Now, my mother was an art teacher. Again, look at that. It's art. Yes, I know. But she was a school art teacher, primary school, secondary school. So she was a pro C, making all the connections here. I grew up with parents who took me to like camps in the summer where artists would come together and paint. And these are like people who have hobbies, and I would start sketching things. So it was through kind of artistic expression. But beyond that, I was really interested in how culture, and that was not the way I would frame it back then when I was a kid. But there is this idea of how growing up in a particular place opens you up to ways of being creative. So again, as a Romanian, having grown up in Romania, I did live Romania many years ago, but I do come back and so on. I'm fascinated by folk culture. I'm fascinated by storytelling and humor and the way in which, as a national identity, Romanians think of themselves as, we've always been kind of historically oppressed and, challenged and all of that. And that's true enough. But we've always kind of managed to outwit or to kind of be faster or quicker or more creative, than all these challenges or our oppressors or whatever. So I think, it fascinated me, all of these questions. And I ended up,
I'm
yeah,
very
yeah,
curious
please.
about this because, I think that, there's a lot of times people in their lives go through some very
Mm,
devastating
right.
experience in regards to the thing that they like. So it's not about other things, but something that they're pursuing. There's like, I would say, I don't know whether it's right to frame it the dark side, but just some events happen which can be very disturbing, which cause people to either lose their confidence in their own beliefs or in what they're doing. And did any such incident perhaps happen with
Mhm.
you, or if or can one guide
Yeah,
themselves to actually grow from it and not become scared and give up? Which is the
that's
other thing that happens
that
often.
is a very big question. Challenges in life. I mean, life is about challenges. It is about how we define and face challenges.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have to say I've been quite fortunate not to have any big traumatic event. I think for me it was this idea of movement and moving. And I've been a migrant a lot of my life. But basically I think now more than half of my life because I'm growing older. And I've been going to different places to do my studies and then start a family and work in different places. And I think there is an identity challenge to that, and the big question that follows us everywhere really about who am I, and this is a creative challenge. There is no preset answer that people give to that. So in that sense, I think this process, the creative self-discovery, let's say, was something that I certainly have in my life, that you and everyone has. I think the idea of a trauma and traumatic event, I mean, it's a very it is part of all these big myth like ideas, in the sense that sadly not everybody overcomes trauma creatively. I think this is something that needs also support and help to happen, and not everybody who is creative necessarily had a trauma.
Thanks for clarifying that, because I think that we automatically assume these kind
Yeah.
of things. I also feel that you always had like an adventurous spirit. When where because it takes a lot of courage to kind of move places and begin again, keep reinventing in a certain way. How did this sort of a adventurous spirit, because it really takes courage. I feel most people aren't able to let go their comfort zone. They like to
Yeah.
stay there, and they like to create, they like to think they can do things, but they're not willing to be the person that it takes to be able to really, become fearless, become okay with reinventing constantly.
Sometimes when, especially when we're young, we do things that we don't question at that level when they happen to us. And I think we all have an age where we are more adaptable and more open to things, and potentially, at the younger age where I left Romania with was doing my master's, my PhD, and then start my career. But I think I was always fascinated. I'm taking it back to social psychology almost. A lot of my thinking around creativity is about self and other. It's about the role of others, whether it's people, groups, cultures, or even materials, and the otherness of creation. And with the other comes a difference. I mean, why is a self and another? Because there is difference, and difference is something we talk a lot about with creativity and innovation and all. I mean, it's a story of diversity. It's a story of meeting things that are different than you. That's a huge engine of creativity. Even for people who never move, there are differences within our everyday experience that, of course, we build on. But if you do move, yes, then those differences become so big, that you have to face them. And I think I've been quite lucky to face a lot of them, with a positive, like very adapted kind of way. But I do recognize, and I think going back to art and everything we said, I mean, there are people who turn these experiences into something even more creative because they go through even more things, meeting difference. Yeah.
So, has just traveling across different countries, how challenging
Mm,
is that? I mean, what really are the core challenges when you actually
yeah.
move countries? Uh, Personally, what have you found to be the biggest
Ooh, great
challenges?
question. So, do you want me to list the countries I've been moving from? Because so I grew up in
Yeah, that
Romania,
would be
and
interesting
then
to
I
know.
did part of my postgraduate studies in London, so in the UK. Then I had my academic job in
Mm,
Denmark. Then I had my second academic job in Switzerland. Then I had now my third big academic job in Ireland, which I hope we settle in. And we were quite settled. And I also have a small percentage in Norway. So and then I've been teaching,
that's a
I've
lot.
been teaching occasionally in Italy and France and Poland, sometimes living there for a few months and giving different courses. So I um, I know academic culture, north, south, center, east, west, in Europe. I did the tour. Um, yeah, I think, I mean, I always loved this idea of novelty. I have to say, we talked about the new of meeting new things, but at the same time, I think I was quite sheltered. Not only the world was quite different, even 10, 15 years ago. I mean, let's cast our minds back if we have the
Yes,
age to see what has happened. Not many great things, I mean, in the world of today.
yes.
But also, I think academic cultures shelter you in some ways. You have this quest, and you meet people, you meet communities, and I'm sure with practitioners is the same. It's finding your tribe. And I've been very lucky to find, like, in London, and then in Denmark and Switzerland, and now in Ireland, is my tribe has always been kind of critical community and even political psychology. So something that is a bit different than your mainstream. I'm not your traditional psychologist, and I've been very fortunate to kind of build those connections wherever I went, and that introduced me then to local culture. So it's really about, it's again very social, isn't it? It's this creativity of engagement and interaction.
But how did psychology become something that you wanted to dedicate your life to before the more creative kind of was it creativity first or was it
Well,
psychology
chicken and egg.
first?
No, I began with. I'll be honest. I
Yes,
began with
yes.
psychology, although the very first study I did as a first year undergraduate in Bucharest, Romania, about
Mm,
art and
mm.
drawing and children, because my mom was an art teacher. So I even published a book in Romanian with my mother on like the drawing development, artistic development of kids. And that book still exists in very few copies, and it's in Romanian. It's kind of a historical artifact by this point. But but anyway, so yeah, they were tied together, I think from day one. Um Psychology, yeah. Psychology was interesting to me because I started actually with animal behavior. As a kid, I was fascinated by animal behavior. I didn't know it's a whole science called etology. I thought, okay, you need to become a vet if you love animals, but I can't do the surgeries and the blood and even the biochemistry of it all. So it was always the behavior.
Wow.
So that really led me to, like, human behavior. And I'll be honest, I mean, I know people are listening from all sorts of professions and backgrounds, but what is more fascinating than human behavior?
Absolutely. But truly,
Yeah.
truly, have studying psychology ever had a challenging impact on you? Have you ever felt that, oh my God, this is too heavy to take in? Has such a thing ever been your case? Because there's some people, some of my
Yeah.
friends who are counselors who've studied psychology, and sometimes they complain. They say that we cannot take anymore. We didn't know that the world had so
Yes.
many
Yes, it
problems
does.
and we're
Well, you
drained.
see, I mean,
So,
what do I study in psychology? Not necessarily trauma, racism, discrimination, but creativity. So there are ways you have to choose your topic carefully. But I do admire and appreciate so much colleagues who can dedicate, and I know many of them, their lives to, let's say, the darker sides of human nature and experience. Not that creativity doesn't have its own dark sides, but just to say there, yeah, when I started psychology back in Bucharest, everybody would think, oh, I'm going to become a therapist. And that's part of the myth of psychology. And I'll be honest, when I started psychology, I thought I'm going to become a therapist.
Yeah.
It's like the one way. Of course, psychology is so much more diverse. And from year one, I was introduced to, from therapy to experimental research and all sorts of stuff. And I ended up loving social psychology. And it was part of that burden that especially some psychologists who do therapy put on themselves. And I deeply admire them. I think to me, to be a therapist, you need to make a decision as to how human beings are and how they function. And you have to make choices that I didn't feel ready, and I wouldn't feel ready now to make. Maybe it's just the creativity in me. You see, I don't want to settle. So
Right.
it is a burden. It is a burden. Yeah.
Yeah, why I ask this question is also because psychology is all about the mind, dealing with the mind. And when it comes to creativity, what that as I've personally experienced it, I have experienced it more like phenomenology, as in, just like the body experience of singing, of music, of creating
Yeah.
music, the vibrations of the sound. Or when I paint, very often I feel like a bodily urge. I need to lift the brush in my hand. I need to go deal with that canvas, with the resistance of the canvas. So here, my thinking mind actually
Yeah.
just stops. It's like, I don't know what's going to emerge. And so I was wondering that, coming from the background of psychology, which interprets creativity with thought, how have you managed to balance out these two aspects of the biology, the phenomenology,
Well,
together with the
here,
thinking
this is
mind?
going to become a discussion about psychology because it's a very interesting discussion. But just to say, psychology is also very diverse. I think, sadly, I'm going to say that, sadly, I will stand by it. We are reducing
Mm,
in
mm,
popular understanding, but also in the way scientific research is kind of funded and pushed forward. We are reducing a lot to the conscious mind, exactly as you said, to cognition, which is the way we think, to neuroscience, which is the brain and how it works. Cognitive neuroscience is probably the first thing that people, in the highest honor to kind of work on as psychologists. Then this shouldn't
yeah,
be like that.
yeah,
So my area of
yeah.
psychology was always about the cultural, the relational, the embodied. And there are many psychologists who work on that. So I think, speaking of finding your tribe, you need to discover whatever discipline you do, what is your take on it. And that's why, I said I'm not a conventional traditional psychologist. For me, interdisciplinary kind of research and work. So I define myself a lot as a social scientist almost, or a social and human science, rather than pure
Nice.
psychology, because I draw so much from
Mm,
anthropology, linguistics, philosophy, sociology. So I think
yeah.
that's a good, for listeners who are interested in psychology, look for these paths because they do
Yeah, yeah.
exist.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing and really clarifying this understanding, because I too thought that psychology was really study of the mind. But the mind comprises of all these dimensions too. And
Yeah,
the minute you said embodied, it's that too is something that the mind, we have to go through the mind often to understand a
absolutely.
lot of what we
Absolutely.
understand.
Yeah. And I think when you study something like creativity, although people have turned it into such a mental, why do we say creative ideas? The first thing that comes to mind when it's creativity is the light bulb, it's the idea. And ideas are great, and I love studying ideas. But where do ideas come from? How are ideas expressed? They're not a light bulb, they're not just a mental neuronal representation. They live
Absolutely.
in the space of
Yeah.
communication
Yeah.
between you and I. That whatever we have in our brain, how does it gain meaningfulness? Is by meeting the world outside of it. So I
Mhm,
think as psychologists, you
mhm,
cannot, a creativity researcher type of psychologist, you cannot stop at
mm,
within the brain. Yeah.
mm. How did creativity studies develop as a field? And where do you think that it is at
I'm
now?
gonna tell you a story. No, I'm gonna group it. I actually I wrote when I started my PhD many years ago now. I wrote about these three paradigms and I called them he, I, and we. And I like this pronoun kind of catalog organization for things. So the he paradigm, and I called it he deliberately to kind of expose the very gendered, almost like sexist ideological idea that
Mm,
men's
mm,
creativity has been the one really celebrated and so on. The he paradigm is the paradigm of the genius. So a lot of early ideas, even before psychology was a science, these very old philosophical ideas, and down to mythological and biblical or religious ideas, the creator, the act of creation. There is something very spiritual, transcendental. There are divinities. It's not for everybody. It's not mankind's creativity. But then the I paradigm is the paradigm of each and every person holding their own creativity. And in Western culture, at least, you have this landmark moment of the Renaissance and other historical times where, we kind of brought within us what we initially thought was God or gods or things like that. And we kind of took ownership of it. But
mm,
we did it in a game,
mm,
again, very individualistic way. So each and every creative separately and
mm,
individually. And then the we paradigm is this collective as the
mm.
co-creation. And I think, again, especially going back to Western cultures, because in Eastern spaces or other spaces, the we was, kind of predominant from earlier on. But sadly, I'm going to say sadly again, the globalized view of what creativity is really prioritizes a Western understanding that is very individualistic. But think about the internet, social media, even AI now, the interconnectedness of the world. I think you cannot think anymore of creativity in purely individual terms. Who creates alone? Based on what? When the time of the geniuses, when we celebrated Da Vinci and all,
Yeah.
it was possible to have the world's knowledge in your lifetime, in your library, because, somehow, today that is impossible. Creativity and knowledge are fundamentally distributed. So I think the story of creativity follows the story of humanity because it also fuels it. Creativity is the engine of a lot of that history. And I think if you look at technological innovation, cultural, social, political, that's where you see we're also on the cusp of a huge transformation now with AI, because it challenges fundamentally this question: who is doing the creating? So it's exciting.
Right. In fact, I had a question about that. But I mean, since we've organically come to this topic, I feel it might be best to just
Sure,
address this right
solve
now.
it.
That I think that there's the biggest fear for people that that with AI coming, just in a very simple take, do you think that human creativity is actually endangered because of
No,
AI?
so there everybody can relax. No, I think that the answer is nuanced. I think there are real impacts on jobs and livelihoods and obvious, and we see that. AI is replacing jobs. I mean, it depends the type of job and so on, but human creativity actually might gain from this. I mean, I'm trying to be optimistic here in some ways, but if you think about it, at the end of the day, the thing that will distinguish us from these machines taking over is this idea of creativity. I have a very good friend and colleague, Giovanni Corazza, who kind of connected this to dignity. What is the dignity of ourselves as humans? Creativity will become part of that. The AI can do so many things and actually can help a bit with ideation. There are many studies that, and there are some arguments, and maybe the ideas are not as original and so on, but it can definitely be part of a creative process. It can become a tool and a partner almost of creators, and you see that all around. But replacing it, no. Creativity has always been shaped by the tools we use, from the probably the kind of the stones and the kind of chisel we did, to the printing
Mhm.
press, to computers, and now
Yeah.
AI is a very special tool. It's something that none of the other tools faced us with. But creativity has always been tool enabled. So I think there is a story there where, being mindful of pitfalls, and there are many, maybe it's a time to really value and ask deeper questions about ourselves as creatives. So it's a good time. It's a good time to talk about it.
Yeah, because I was having this discussion a few days back with my friends who are both singers, musicians, and as well as artists, painters, and they were really complaining that nowadays you just have music automatically produced, which is new, which is different. um, and it's actually sounds good. And I was sharing my experience with two particular pieces. One was a completely new song,
Yeah.
which I thought was great. And there was one which was using a dead artist's voice that AI had created to combine it with a
Wow.
super hit current day song. And that too sounded good. But in that case, I immediately rejected it because I said, this person has been dead for the past 40 years. And to just hear his voice, in a current hit song, it just felt fake and I felt a distance. In the second case, where I heard a new song that I actually liked when I first heard it. But then the minute I was told, oh, this is made by I can't even tell you. I just lost interest in the song. So I sometimes wonder that are we okay with even human imperfections? But we like that experience that
Right.
somebody has toiled over this. They've gone through a
Right.
process of making. And perhaps when that process is taken away, because I wondered, why did I just lose interest? I just didn't feel like hearing it anymore, although I'd liked it initially. And that's when I realized we like the toil, we just like the humanity involved in that being something real. So
Well,
this
it
actually
speaks
just
to this idea that we recover an interest and attention to creativity. I think also it's such exceptionally interesting, what happens when we realize who creates something. And I'm going to extend this paradigm. Studies can be made, and I think some have been made. When you see an interesting painting, what would happen if you knew it was just made by a baby who didn't know, or a kid, didn't know what they were doing? Maybe it would gain in value for you, but it will change the perspective. Or what would happen if you heard an elephant did it or a chimp did it? I'm talking about painting that is kind of more, kind of non-figurative but expressionist. It's the
yeah,
same a bit with
simplest.
AI.
Yeah.
It's and people can almost feel betrayed, like, oh, because we have assumptions. Again, going back to assumptions, I think with AI, I mean, obviously this human element, as you said, the toil, the authenticity, the humanity of it all, that needs to be preserved. And I think artists are making huge steps to kind of protect themselves and their persona, even, their ideas or something, because there's a huge question of ethics and economics as well with AI. But I think as we move
Yeah.
forward,
Yeah.
it's this hybridization of creativity. Like I do think that somebody clicking on a button, make me a song, and AI makes it, will be different than working with AI to perfect, get some ideas, test things out, control the process. And a lot of the things in the world of today, whether we
Absolutely.
like it or not, will be co-created with AI. I don't know if your listeners will appreciate that, but it is just the way the reality will work. I think it really raises big questions around how can we kind of prepare or educate ourselves, in working with this.
So coming to your work, Vlad, um, how did your ideas, your thoughts start to crystallize on certain aspects of creativity that got you to really start? So I'd be interested in knowing that which were one of your earliest kind of works.
Mm. That's a great question. You know, when I started, so it was obviously connected to craft, but I was really influenced by Donald Winnicott, and I don't. It's a kind of a child psychologist and psychiatrist, actually, working in a kind of psychoanalytical tradition. And I don't get to use as much Winnicott's work, but it was really instructive to look at almost like human development and how we start out as, from kids to adults, and we build these symbolic creative spaces that kind of shelter us. And he had some very psychoanalytical ideas around the union between babies and usually mothers, to call them mothers, and of course today is more like caregivers and so on. But um that's one line of work, or one early inspiration. But then soon after, I started discovering, I don't know, American pragmatism, dialogism, including kind of Soviet psychology and so on. And I diversified. But one of the very first kind of things that I started with and I kept all this time. And I think one of my, probably my first thing I ever wrote about creativity, you see, you're taking me back in time, was an editorial for a journal I was editing years ago. And I think it was thinking outside the box of individualism. So this was already very important to me. And I think thinking outside of the box is such a creative cliche. And I mean, it has some meanings. But then the individual and individualism in particular, there's a difference here, just very briefly. I'm not anti-individual. I think individuals create, I am an individual, you're an individual. We need to think of them. Um, but individualism is reducing everything to the individual. So as a creativity researcher, if you ask all your questions about what is the person inside the person with it, then you're missing out on the relationship between that person and other people, or the context around the person. So individualism is something that concerns me, and I find it quite reductionist and so on, but individuals are great. I'm gonna
No,
specify
I mean,
that.
that's so important. And, I think it's also because of this aspect that perhaps creativity hasn't been understood. Because the second part, which is the usefulness in the definition,
Mhm.
I feel that that happens because something has to be useful in order for it to be called creative. And if it's only useful to the self, it's very limiting.
Yeah.
Generally, we all strive. Our whole reason is we want that recognition. We want to feel we made a difference.
Mhm.
We did something of value. And so, when it comes to creativity, I think that if we only think individually, it's just really very limiting.
Yeah. Yeah. And
And
and you see, but and exactly this, it's like you can recognize the role of individuals in creating something, but if you reduce it all to themselves and creating for oneself, it's you're missing out. It's not that it doesn't happen,
completely.
but it's about the big picture. And you're also skewing
Yes.
creativity into something else.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, it actually follows to, that idea that if we look at nature, when a tree produces fruit, it doesn't eat its own fruit. It produces the fruit, but the fruit is always taken by others, or if it provides shade,
Yeah.
it doesn't sit down to enjoy its own shade. It actually provides
Oh, that's a
shade.
beautiful
And that's
metaphor.
why the tree
Yeah.
is so valued. I mean,
Right.
that's the purpose of every life, to seek value,
Eh,
to seek
yeah.
a thing that I made a difference. That's why we even like to create. It's not it only
Mhm.
keeping on solving our own little problems, but it's about making a difference, about striving for that.
I think you're touching on something so beautiful here. I'm gonna remember this metaphor. It's really great about the tree making fruit not for itself, as it were, but to kind of share. And that's how the tree
Yeah.
develops and grows and remains. So James Kaufman, who I mentioned because of the four C's, he works on this meaning and creativity and legacy. And I think this idea of legacy is very important. If you work creatively in a very selfish, self-centered way, you're missing out on exactly what makes creativity shine, which is communication, which is community building, which is the legacy, which is kind of growing something outside and beyond yourself. Otherwise, there will be no continuity to that. So I think that's the story of the tree as well. It's very beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very, very well said.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. So, Vlad, after this, because the 5 A's is
Mhm.
really quite profound, and it makes these beautiful connections. So, rather than my getting into it, I feel that
Uh,
the creator himself should really
Creator, exactly,
explain,
the actor, the creative actor.
uh, the
That
five
would be
A's,
A
because
is
it's such a
very
helpful model. And one thing that I would like to say is that perhaps the earlier, or the first ABCs, like I feel you've written a book with that, but the first, it began from perhaps the 4 Ps by Melrose, which is person, process, product, press. So it kind of lays the initial requirements for creativity, that you need to have a person. That person, in order to create, has to have a process. Then finally a product gets made. But then the last, which is the press, the
Yeah.
people, press, the reviews that you read in newspapers, the press, they give their verdict on what got created. So these were the initial four important structural things that were in place. But they were not adequate to. So they're like the ABCs, that before you learn a language, you need to know the ABCs. So it was very helpful in doing that work. But
Yeah.
then I feel that the five A's added more nuance and more
Mm,
connections in
mm.
how we are actually able to understand this in a deeper
Right.
way. So would you like to
I'm
explain the five
delighted.
A's
Yes,
to
I'll
us?
go back to the five A's, which it is something where I kind of stayed, conceptually. And thank you for asking that, because indeed, Rhodes's model, the four P's. I mean, in a way, you can map the A's into the P's, and it's more of a structural view of when you put those glasses on as a researcher or practitioner, and you think, what is important for creativity? What are the elements? But that's an interesting, even question of elements that are needed. And language is so important. I mean, a lot of the five A's is about the language we use to think of creativity. And words matter because words carry history and meaning and also guide your thinking. So the P's are elements that can be looked at also separately. And this was an observation I've seen, going to conferences and hearing people say, oh yeah, there are the four P's and you can look at different things, but my P is the creative person. And I'm going to do a study of the creative person. Or somebody would say, I work on the process. That's my P there. And but then how can you work on the process without the person, or the person without the process? So I think it's a trap of language, because without Rhodes intending that, and I think in the manuscript is quite clearly written that they connect with each other, there is work to be done into looking at them holistically. So that was the beginning of that, was when you say actor or agent, or actor instead of person, or action instead of just process, or artifact instead of product, or you would say affordance for context, and so on. You invite questions of relationship. So there is no actor without audience, and there is no audience without an actor. And these roles change and shift. And, look at us in this dialogue. We're actors and audiences to each other, and we are at different times, So I think the five A's was born out of looking at creativity more holistically, but also bringing in the materiality aspect of it. So, interestingly, the P of press. What is press? What is, it needed, some people call it place, or, they try to put more context into it. But it's this view of everything external to the person is kind of a pressure point. And it's a bit negative, I mean, we are pressured by things outside of us, but we're also enabled by them. So I think already we're kind of, we have to rethink that bit. And the press is not only people, so it's not just audiences, but it's also what myself and Gibson, and it's a long history, called affordances. And I'm really interested in affordances because it is like action potentials. Every object, I have a little pen here, has multiple affordances. What is something for? Mostly we think of writing, and indeed that's the canonical traditional affordance. But you can do so many more things with this pen. We can almost like pick a lock, and we can, imagine it's a plane. This is affordance. It affords our action. And creativity is really about discovering new affordances and kind of playing with affordances. So the five A's is giving these lenses when you look at a situation to ask yourself, who are the agents and actors, and who are their audiences, and what kind of actions happen in between, and what kind of affordances are being used to create what types of artifacts. And yeah, that's the vocabulary. And interestingly, people a long time have been telling me, okay, there's another word with A. And actually, just recently, I'm working with Diogo Monzo from Brazil on aesthetics, and he's very interested in aesthetics and also kind of these emotional
Mm,
aspects.
mm,
So
mm.
adding affect and aesthetics and other things to the A's. But let me tell you, it's not about the letter. Obviously, it just happened. It just happened to, have an alliteration. What is it called when it starts with the same letter? But it's about the deeper philosophy, and that's why I think the title of the paper, when I wrote it, it's rewriting the language of creativity. And we should be very mindful when we use these words
Mm.
to think, what do they carry, with them?
So when we say, when we talk of the five A's, do you like to imagine them in a sequential way, or do you think they keep on going back and
Oh,
forth with each
absolutely
other?
dynamic. So this is where not only the language, but the visual nature of our perception, dominantly visual, is trapping us. When I make a figure of the five A's, it's usually this bubble with like a triangle in the middle where you have, the actor, the audience, and the artifact, which are really self-other and objects, the very traditional kind of schema of how
Mm,
we live in the world. And then action connects
correct.
everything, and affordances give the roundup, the cultural affordances and norms and values that surround us. But it's still static. I am looking forward to a day, potentially enabled by AI, where schemas we make will immediately rotate and move. So in other papers, I look at the arrow of time crossing these middle triangle and this circle, and how it expands across time. And also the movement, the back and forth, as we said about actor audiences and shifting of position. So for me, the five A's are never static. They are to be looked at in context and in development. It's not you're always the actor of creativity. No, you're going to be an audience of the creativity of others, maybe at the same time as you are acting creatively. So I think that's the
No,
exactly
that's
you
great.
just need a different kind of mind frame. But I will tell you, practitioners, because you were mentioning you do a lot of conversations, they get this, and they would immediately, and I've got this feedback. Yes, that's how it works. Researchers, it's harder. And you know why? Because to do research, you need to sometimes stabilize reality. And it's easier to say the person is different, the process is there, because then I can stop time, and I can do my measurement, and I can report back a number. And I think that is a challenge. With creativity,
Yeah.
sometimes we don't report back a number. It's just how it is.
Yeah. I think, that's a thing that when creativity is studied by academics, they're looking from the
Mm,
outside inwards, whereas the practitioner is always creating from the inside out because it begins with intrinsic motivation that if they aren't even motivated, they
mm,
wouldn't do anything. So the journey always begins from the inside for the practitioner. But I think the academic
mm,
is looking at how did this happen? And what really got made. So what exists, and then they try to backtrack to what was the process or who is the person who actually made this. So it's a reverse
right.
engineering when an academic looks and a practitioner begins with nothing because there's no product, there's no press,
Exactly.
there's nothing. So they're
Have
just
to.
beginning with
Yeah.
with the seed, like what, just with perhaps even before an idea. So I guess that's the difference. But Vlad, is there any simpler way to understand the connections that you were talking about? Like when we talk about person and process, if we're looking at the four B's, which is the very simple baby steps, how would we look at the five A's? What are the
Mm.
things that we could find as the connectors between
Well,
one
a
to the
great
other?
question. And I have a paper somewhere that I remember writing about that. And actually, I have a paper that criticized even the five A's, because it's always good to kind of be critical of your own ideas. But for me, the connector is action. So action is in the center, and I have a very action-oriented view of creativity. So just to take us back a moment on what is the essence of creativity. For some people, it's novelty, and you remember I mentioned difference and engaging, acting difference and on difference.
Yes.
When
Yes.
I started my research, people would ask me, why don't you study imagination? And imagination is beautiful, and it's such a big topic, and it's deeply connected with creativity. But I chose creativity because I wanted to see imagination in action, as it were. I'm really interested in Vygotsky. Again, I mentioned, one big authors talks about externalizing. It's about kind of putting out in the world something, and then getting that impact, and then reshaping, and then moving back and forth. Speaking of that, so for me, the glue of the A's is the actions, because they're actions that link actor and artifact, which is the act of making, let's call it, but it has multiple facets, and giving meaning to stuff is also, part of making, and so on, storytelling around it, and so on. But then you have interestingly, the actor and the audience who collaborate. I mean, when you're in a creative team, you have so many types of actions you do. But when you engage with a general audience or even with your critics, it's a different types of action connections that impact the creative artifact or what's being produced. But interestingly enough, there are actions that happen also in the relation between artifact and audience. So some of the greatest creations ever, the author might be dead, long gone. I think we were mentioning at the beginning something around that. But what keeps them creative is how generations of audiences, generations of people have been looking and reinfusing meaning and value and giving new uses to that artifact. So the actions going around go way beyond thinking, divergent thinking, with all the respect to that, and even the making of the creator. So when you look at this, I call it like the ecology of a creative system, an ecosystem. There is so much more, and there's so many actors. Who is the creative agent or actor? Is it singular or is it plural already? Even when you do stuff that are alone, are you truly alone working creatively with the artifacts you work with? Are they truly of your own making? Speaking of the tree and the seeds, where did the seeds come from? you know so I think it invites all of those questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vlad. That was very helpful in kind of seeing how connections are made and how these conversations are essential. Because without it, you have a very limited notion if you just limit
Right.
it to the word.
Yeah.
Together with this, you broached on the importance of certain words or ideas, concepts like imagination, play, wonder. Can you give us a little bit of insight on how we could think about these
Yeah.
words and how they work
Oh,
in
so we're
regards to
moving to
creativity?
possibilities. I feel it because this is the expanded vocabulary. You see, I love vocabularies. I love the new words or the words because the words carry meaning and they're about something. And when I read about creativity, and this might make me a bit atypical, I like to read wider than creativity. So I like to read work on imagination, work on wonder and curiosity. And many colleagues, they do that. We have colleagues who work on awe and creativity or things like that. But I want systematically to look across all these topics, literatures, and pockets of knowledge and practice that connect us to the core of what it means to create, which is emergence, agency, novelty to some meaningfulness, change, nature of change and transformation, the ethics of choice. All of these are part of a wider landscape. And speaking of, because I think you mentioned very interestingly the forest, and I love that we got a tree metaphor and the forest. Sometimes when we specialize academically, we forget the forest because of the trees. So we really look at our own little tree,
Yes.
and the creativity tree is not a little tree; it's a huge tree. It has many branches, and I'm on the sociocultural branch, which is over there, and then you have these neuroscientists over on another branch, and I don't get to visit them as much, but they're there, and they're doing good work. And then you have individual differences, and so on and so forth. But where is this tree? This tree is in a forest of serendipity, counterfactuals, utopias, dystopias, futures thinking. That is the possibility forest. And I've been greatly inspired. My own awakening to that was I wrote, I think it was 2020. Yeah. I wrote about wonder. So one of my first books, kind of a bit outside, is called Wonder, the Extraordinary Power of an Ordinary Experience with Bloomsbury. And wonder with an O, because it's wonder with an A that is also very interesting, wandering around. Opened my mind to, and the interest I had was, what is this feeling? Going back to the feeling, the body, the experience, the phenomenology of it all. What is this experience of creating? Is it experience of uncertainty, of risk a little bit, of not knowing fully what happens? Because if you're fully in control, arguably you're not deviating, you're not doing the little extra thing. And it's an experience of being excited about what is becoming without fully knowing what it is. And that not knowing is
Mm,
fundamental. And that's where this is what wonder is about. Wonder is about not knowing that is generative. It's not the not knowing we fear from school. Oh, you don't know, that's a mistake. You're wrong or it's bad. it's a productive not knowing. That's why Socrates said that philosophy is born in wonder, and what is philosophy? It's the love of knowledge, so, or wisdom. So there's so many good things, and wonder opened my mind to the fact that as creativity researchers, practitioners, however we define ourselves, we have a duty to understand other works on play, imagination, innovation, improvisation, wonder, and so on. Yeah.
No, that's so great. And the way, you kind of lead it, we would like to hear more in depth about possibilities, the book that you wrote. And also, you've kind of sort of broached it. And the more I think about it, I feel that that is what you're constantly seeking. Like, sometimes you see a person and you know what their DNA is, or what their thumbprint is. And from the very fact that that's also what you're
Yeah.
seeking in the 5 A's. And then in possibilities too, it's could it be this?
Exactly.
Could it
It's
be that? It's
exactly. I
that
mean,
sort of
I'm
a
in love with
mix.
the word possible and possibility. I will have to say possibility thinking pre-exists a lot of my own interest in that, and it goes back to the work of Anna Kraft, late Anna Kraft, colleagues, Pam Barnard, Kerry Chappell, Teresa Kremen. There was this early 2000s wave of research on schools and creativity. So the notion of possibility I didn't invent. Nobody invents a notion, do we? And if we go back in time, I mean, we can go back to Aristotle and then culturally to other cultural spaces that I don't even know about. But it's this old discussion about the real and the possible. And just from the outset, it's a complete mistake to think of the real as the opposite of the possible. Just like constraints are not the opposite of creativity. Creativity cannot happen outside of constraints. The possible doesn't happen outside of reality. So just to put that to rest. But um, just like the impossible is not the opposite of the possible. I'm sorry, I have to say that too, because many times, especially as creators, it is dreaming, imagining, and engaging with the impossible that fuels our actual creativity or possibility. So the possible fascinates me because, as you said, it is my own answer to my question of why am I interested in creativity? Why did I start? And I think it was about, in creativity, we have a very interesting close concept of potential. Potential is very close, but not really the same as possibility. And I gave a few talks. I don't think I wrote about that, but I definitely addressed it. So we talk a lot about creative potential. And what does it mean? It means what you could do creatively. And it's a very empowering and wonderful notion. And I don't reject it. Actually, with Giovanni, who I mentioned before, we wrote a paper about I don't know how many types of potentials. And I like the notion of potential. But it's a bit restrictive to me. Going back to the tree, you see, everything goes back in circles to these metaphors. What is the potential of an acorn? It's to grow into an oak, given the right circumstances, the soil, the light, whatever environment. But it's a very linear thing. If you look at creative potential, it's like you can be good at music. So, you're here and then you can be here with music. Possibility is not about one thing you can become, it's about all the other things. It's about multiple potentialities, which I would call possibilities. It's really expanding our own mind about what could be. It's not as you have the potential to be good in math, now be good in math. How do you use that? It's your own possibility you engage in. And it's really what makes us excited. I mean, when I create whatever I do my own little creative practice, um, I'm excited by not knowing and sensing the possible. It's an experience that you can't even put other words on it, but it's like it's something is there. It's almost within your grasp. It's this excitement about what could be, and that's what I love to study, really.
That's so wonderful. And I was curious that do you have any daily rituals or things that you do to bring you into the zone? That it could be any simple rituals that you tend to do
Yeah,
to keep you
that
activated,
it's a great question. So
inspired.
we have three very young kids at home. So a lot of my daily rituals are mandated. They are like the routine is they do fuel a lot
Yeah,
of this creativity and thoughts of what human creativity is about.
yeah,
One
yeah.
of the things I like to do is a kind of exercise or running, and then I like to. This is a moment. I have a very kind of guided mind where I like to think of stuff and plan. I'm a big planner. I love to plan, and many of us are. But when I exercise or move around or walk, I don't want to plan anything. I can't really, because I can't, like, I need paper and I need to do stuff and I need to write down. So I let myself imagine, so I love, I guess that's the flow and the zone we talk about, which is kind of, you put yourself in scenarios, whether it's about work or other, or even fantasy, like, that fuels me. So I think in some ways it is about movement. Yeah. And then I used to paint. I sadly I don't get to anymore because I don't have the time. I used to paint as a grown up as well. And I remember the letting go feeling of just touching and seeing color. I think there is something magical about the feel of spreading color. And so there was my mindfulness practice, if you want, with that. Yeah.
Mm, mm. That's great, Vlad. Thank you. This conversation has been so interesting and so rewarding for me personally, as I'm sure
Very
it's going to be for the audience. But before I let you go, can you give some information about the things that you're currently doing? I know you've started. Is there a group, the possibility kind of group? What are the things you're doing? Where can people find you?
We have a lot of structures around possibility studies that has grown organically as this lovely community. We have weekly seminars open online. Tomorrow there will be one vis-a-vis where we talk about now time. We have an annual conference.
Wow.
So if people are interested, they can look at Possibility Studies Network and you get all of our activities. And then there is a contact button. And if you put your email, you get all the news and everything that happens. And beyond that, I'm doing different things. My latest work in this area is on possibilities literacy. So together with colleagues, there is a paper and there is a workbook with 450 exercises for kids, teens, and adults. We are now formalizing this idea of engaging with possibility as a kind of literacy, because let's face it, it is such a complex, interrelated system of competencies that we want to educate, speaking of your one of your questions. So if people want to know more, happy to share. They're open access, both the workbook and the article, so people can look. And
Well,
then I
that's
also have
great.
my second novel, my fantasy novel. I my first one is called The Wish Thief, and then The Wish Tree is a trilogy. So I have to write yet another one. But I'm I'm also doing some kind of literary.
Wow.
I don't know if I should encourage people to read that because they might read it and think, "Oh no, I've changed my mind." But yeah,
No, you should.
but yeah,
Yeah,
so
you
I'm
must.
trying to keep busy. But yeah, it's really a joy to be able to share, and I'm so grateful for the invitation. It's always nice to think together. Yeah,
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Vlad. This has been a really, truly memorable episode for me because I got to really speak about
oh,
my favorite topic, creativity,
very
with
kind.
a master in that domain, and so it's a real pleasure. And
Thank you so
thank you
much.
so much for coming. And hopefully, we'll have
Here,
you in
I am
again with
here and
some
ready.
other,
Thank you.
in some
Thanks.
additional context. Yeah. Thank you,
Thanks.
Vlad. Thank you so much.